GamingBolt presents 15 biggest PlayStation fails that Sony wants you to forget. We're now at a point where the PlayStation brand has become almost synonymous with console gaming, and it's all thanks to some incredible work by Sony over the years, whether it be in terms of marketing, developing top-notch hardware, or building an incredible lineup of first-party games and franchises. However, that doesn't mean that Sony has been completely faultless in how it has conducted themselves over the years. Not at all. What they've done with the PlayStation brand is commendable, but here in this feature, we're going to talk about 15 of the biggest screw-ups in the history of PlayStation. The mismanagement of the PS Vita. The PSP managed to grow into a huge success, in spite of Sony rather than because of them, and their indifference towards the handheld market caught up with them when the PS Vita hit the market. It's a shame, really. The PS Vita is an excellent piece of hardware, and if managed properly, it could have turned into a great system. But a system is only as good as the games that are on it, and Sony decided to almost completely neglect the Vita. There was next to no first-party support for it, and the games that they did make for the handheld were mostly developed by B-tier teams that had no idea what they were doing. Sure, there were a few bright spots, but ultimately, thanks to a complete lack of support and next to no marketing for the system, the PS Vita never got the life and success that we all know it deserved. It makes you wonder why they even made an incredible system in the first place. PS Vita memory cards. This right here is one of the biggest reasons for the failure of the PS Vita, besides the minimal marketing and lack of first-party support, of course. Rather than letting people use standard SD cards for their storage in the PS Vita systems, like any other normal company would, Sony decided it would be a good idea to make the storage cards for the handheld completely proprietary. And if that wasn't enough, they decided to sell them at outrageous prices. A god-awful decision if there ever was one, and one we still cannot get our heads around. PlayStation TV. The PlayStation TV originally seemed like such a good idea. Being able to play classic PSP games and the new PS Vita ones on the big screen, who would not want that? But as is the case with so many other pieces of hardware developed by Sony that originally seemed like good ideas, the PS TV just didn't get enough support, and as a result, it couldn't get the traction it needed with the gaming audience. Firstly, there was the issue that so many of the PS Vita games couldn't even be played on the PS TV, due to the fact that it couldn't support input methods such as the gyroscope. When you add to the fact that there weren't many games on the PS Vita to begin with, and the fact that the PS TV was targeting an already negligible install base, you can see how all of that potential went to waste. iToy. The biggest issue with iToy was that, when all was said and done, it was nothing more than an experiment for Sony, and it showed in how much they supported it and the fact that they really didn't. And since they didn't, not a lot of other developers and publishers did either. Besides that, people just didn't respond to the iToy. Its failures were actually rather similar in nature to the Kinect. People need controllers and buttons to allow for some sort of interactivity and contact between their actions and the on-screen action. In complete absence of those things just don't feel right. This is something Sony freely admitted as time went on as well, and it was also mostly why the iToy just couldn't kick into gear. PS Move. Close to a decade ago, motion controls were all the rage. Thanks to the Nintendo Wii, pointing your controller at your TV and waggling it like crazy to get your in-game character to do stuff was starting to become a trend. And Sony, they wanted to cash in on it. To be fair, they couldn't really have known that motion controls as they were back then would end up just being a temporary gimmick rather than the new way to play games. But like so many of their other hardware releases, their post-launch support for the PS Move made you wonder why they even bothered spending the time and resources on developing it. Sure, they tacked on move controls in a few of their AAA titles, but you could never shake the feeling that the PS Move was nothing more than an afterthought, a mere cash grab that Sony never really believed in the first place. SIXAXIS. There is no PlayStation without DualShock. That belief was cemented into the eyes of almost everyone when the PS3 launched with a new kind of controller. On face value, the SIXAXIS was the same as the DualShock, but it really wasn't. For starters, it didn't have that rumble feedback. That seems like such a small thing, but just playing your games without vibration, they feel dull, they feel lifeless. There was no rumble in the SIXAXIS, and it took so much away from the experience of playing video games, and the thing that was supposed to be its hook, motion controls, was inaccurate and unwieldy. Granted, there was a lot that Sony did with the SIXAXIS controller that was commendable, like more precise analog sticks and turning the shoulder buttons into shoulder triggers and including a home button. But they only really got it right on the second attempt with the DualShock 3. Lair. This hurts us. It physically hurts us. Lair looked like such a cool concept. playing as a badass knight that rides into battles on top of a giant dragon and burns scores of enemies to crisps, an entire game built around that concept, touted as the next big PlayStation exclusive. And look what it turned into. Sony decided to take an incredible concept and then ruin it by turning it into a poorly executed gimmick. The SIXAXIS motion controls were tacked onto the game, and quite predictably, they didn't work out at all. They weren't just tacked on either. They were the only way to play this damn game. Lair didn't give players the option to play with traditional controls. Sure, a patch a few months after the game's launch added that as an option, but by then it had become clear that what had originally been a badass concept on paper was nothing more than a poor advertisement for a clunky gimmick. PS Home. What a mess this was. The idea of having a social networking platform integrated with a virtual Second Life style game was actually a pretty interesting one in theory, but Sony just couldn't get it out of second gear. PS Home was plagued with clunky, annoying mechanics, and the idea of spending actual, real-life money on in-game, meaningless virtual content like new clothes, of all things, and furniture for your virtual home just never appealed to anyone. The fact that PS Home never even got out of beta in all of the years that it was still online shows that maybe even Sony didn't quite know what to do with it. $599. You know exactly what we're talking about. This happened back before the launch of the PlayStation 3, in the days when, with unprecedented success of the PS2, Sony were practically kings of the video game industry, and perhaps that success got to their heads. Perhaps they thought they could do nothing wrong. That no matter what, people would buy the PS3, but boy did they screw things up big time with this one. At E3 2006, Sony announced that the PlayStation 3 would be launching for an obscenely high price of $599. Nobody could believe it, and Sony's subsequent arrogance regarding the price only seemed to drive prospective buyers even further away. That said, Sony did end up slashing the prices as time went on, as is evidenced by the eventual success of the PS3, but we just won't ever be able to forget that ridiculous price tag. E3 2006. Did we say E3 2006? We did, didn't we? It brings up some very painful memories, and in retrospect, a lot of laughter too. Sony's E3 2006 press conference is almost legendary at this point, a perfect illustration of everything that you should not do at E3. We've already spoken about the $599 moment, but there was so much more. They said that they weren't interested in gimmicks and then went on to talk about the Eye of Judgment. There was a Ridge Racer announcement for the PSP that has become the thing of legend at this point. There was a disastrous demonstration of the SIXAXIS, and of course, there was that one thing from recorded history about Japanese battles that actually took place, the one, the only, the giant enemy crab. Misleading trailers during E3 2005. Sony has mastered the art of delivering near-perfect E3 conferences by this point, but it wasn't always this way. We've already spoken about E3 2006, but in retrospect, their press event at E3 2005 was also something of a mess. There was just so much misleading stuff in that conference. For starters, there were announcements for games that never saw the light of day on the PS3, such as Neo, which only finally came out earlier this year, Identify, Fifth Phantom Saga, and more. They also focused on games like Resistance: Fall of Man. The difference between the advertised product and the final game was massive, not to mention the fact that they constantly tried to pass off what was clearly CG footage as in-game footage, just a complete mess all around. PS3 downgrade. The PS3 was an incredibly powerful system when it first launched, and for a long time it was one of the most powerful pieces of gaming hardware people had ever seen. But it was actually supposed to be even more powerful. The PS3 received some significant downgrades back when it first launched, with Sony cutting its GPU, which ran at 550 MHz core with 700 MHz memory, to 500 MHz core with 650 MHz memory. Sure, it didn't end up harming the system in its rivalry with the Xbox 360 in terms of which of the two was more powerful, but paying all that money for a system which was not going to be as technically impressive as you thought it would be might have been a little annoying for consumers, to say the least. UMDs. You sometimes can't help but think that Sony really tried their best to screw it up with the PSP. It's a wonder the system did as well as it did. The UMDs were an absolute mess. Sony tried their best to push the media format, touting it as the future of multimedia, but what it really was a crippling device for an otherwise excellent system. The UMDs resulted in excruciatingly long load times, not to mention the fact that they drained the PSP's battery. Sony did eventually give in and tried to do away with the format with the advent of the PSP Go, but by that point, the damage had already been done. And that reminds us, PSP Go. The PSP Go was actually a really cool idea in retrospect, and it was quite ahead of its time. The idea of a system that focuses first and foremost on purchasing games digitally rather than physically doesn't seem outlandish in today's day and age, but back then, maybe the world just wasn't ready for something like that. That said, the PSP Go did get a lot of things horribly wrong. Rather than choosing to focus more on digital distribution, it focused only on digital distribution, alienating both retailers and people who had already bought a bunch of UMDs. In addition, the system had a terrible battery life, at around 3 hours, which ticked people off even more. And to top it all off, it launched at a price of $250, and people just weren't willing to purchase a mere system upgrade for that much money when they could have just bought a PS3 for $50 more. PSN hack. The PSN hack was a terrible thing, not just for Sony, but also for its customers. In 2011, PlayStation Network was hacked, and not only were PS3 owners left stranded with no way to be able to play online, something that had at that point become a major part of gaming culture, but the details of millions of PSN users were also stolen. Sony's attempts to fix the issue were long drawn and embarrassing. While credit must be given to them for trying to make up for it by providing free games to their users, it's just not an incident that can be easily forgotten. Not only did it result in a massive loss amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars for Sony, but also in a huge loss of trust and goodwill amongst the masses. And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at GamingBolt, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.